It all started on a sunny day in the Willow Creek Gardens neighborhood when Benjamin Foster, a middle-aged architect who loved tending to his garden, noticed something odd. His old red oak, which he had planted with his father decades ago, had a deep cut in its trunk, as if someone had tried to saw it during the night. As he investigated, Benjamin could never have imagined that this would be the start of a silent war with his new neighbor, a woman determined to turn the community into a field of strict rules and paranoia. But in the end, something unexpected would happen, something that would change all the bonds in the neighborhood forever. When Meredith Clark bought the corner house with its wide windows and freshly painted wooden porch, the entire block seemed to hold its breath. It was a house that begged for new life, and Meredith, in her early 50s, seemed perfect for the role. The widow of a famous lawyer, she exuded elegance in her impeccable tailored suits, her blonde hair always tied up in a bun that defied gravity. At neighborhood social gatherings, she handed out smiles as polished as her high-heeled shoes. "What a refined woman," whispered the ladies of the Homeowners Association. "She'll bring some class to our corner," others said, excited about the prospect of a breath of renewal. But it didn't take long for the mask of friendliness to start cracking. In her first week, Meredith was already walking around with a clipboard, jotting down infractions invisible to the average eye. First, it was the Ferreira family's house next door, which received a formal complaint for non-standard grass, as if anyone actually measured the blades of their lawn. Then old Mr. Torres, who spent his days tending to his rose bushes, was caught off guard by a harsh notice. Hanging clothes on a clothesline, according to Meredith, was inappropriate for the neighborhood's aesthetic. The poor man, who could barely hear properly, stood on his porch holding the letter with trembling hands, unable to understand what he'd done wrong. The neighbors began exchanging wary glances. "Does she think she runs the place?" muttered Donna Clara during a coffee chat. "Just wait, she'll get tired of it soon," another replied. But there was something about Meredith, her rigid posture, the gaze that seemed to catalogue every movement, that made the air feel heavier. It was as if she wasn't just observing the neighborhood, but judging it, piece by piece. Benjamin, who lived 3 houses down, watched it all with a mix of curiosity and caution. At 38, he was the kind of guy who knew the name of every dog on the block and greeted everyone with a lazy wave. He had bought his house 12 years ago with the hard-earned money from his years as a carpenter and turned the backyard into a little oasis of herbs and rustic furniture he crafted himself. He'd dealt with difficult neighbors before, the couple who fought at the top of their lungs, the teenager who tested his car's sound system at 3 a.m. But Meredith was different. It wasn't just her control freak tendencies or her petty complaints. There was something about her, a calculated coldness that he couldn't quite figure out. Sometimes Benjamin caught her staring out her window, her eyes fixed on his house, as if she were measuring something beyond the length of his fence. He tried to ignore it. Let her busy herself with other people's lawns, he thought as he watered his lavender. But deep down a bad feeling was growing. Benjamin knew that sooner or later Meredith would turn her attention to him, and when that happened, it wouldn't just be a silly notice about clotheslines or grass. It would be personal. It was a quiet morning in Willow Creek, one of those days when the sun barely warms and the scent of dew still lingers in the air. Benjamin was on his porch, as usual, sitting in a wooden chair he'd carved himself years ago. A steaming mug of coffee rested on the small table beside him, and he was flipping through a sketchbook, jotting down ideas for a new furniture project. The neighborhood was silent, except for the occasional bird song and the distant hum of a lawnmower. It was the kind of peace Benjamin cherished, a moment just for himself before the day started to race by. That's when he heard a click, then another. He looked up, frowning, and saw a man standing on the sidewalk about 10 meters away, thin, with wire-rimmed glasses and a polo shirt tucked into his pants. The man was holding a camera, pointing it directly at the red oak in Benjamin's yard. The tree, with its wide branches and leaves that blazed in the fall, was his pride and joy, planted by his father decades ago when the house still belonged to the family. Benjamin stood up, mug still in hand, and called out, "Hey, buddy, what are you photographing there?" The man hesitated, lowering the camera with a rehearsed smile. "Just documenting," he replied in the tone of someone reciting a script. I work for the Visual Preservation Committee. Benjamin blinked, confused. Committee of what? He took a few steps toward the fence, still holding his coffee. Never heard of that in Willow Creek. The man adjusted his glasses, clearly uncomfortable but maintaining his composure. It's a new initiative to ensure the neighborhood's aesthetic harmony. Orders from Mrs. Clark. Meredith's name hit Benjamin like a punch to the gut. He looked at the man, then at the tree, then back at the man. Aesthetic harmony? He repeated, with a half smile that didn't hide his irritation. Is my tree blocking someone's view or something? The photographer shrugged, muttering something about just following instructions, and hurried off, as if afraid Benjamin might jump the fence. Later that morning, Benjamin knocked on Donna Clara's door, the neighborhood's official gossip, who knew everything before it even happened. Sitting in her living room amid teacups and a plate of cinnamon rolls, he found out what was going on. Meredith, with that energy of someone who always has a plan, had invented a so-called visual preservation subcommittee out of thin air. No meetings, no vote, not even a notice in the neighbors' mailboxes. Worse, she was distributing papers with rules no one had ever heard of. Things like trees cannot obscure more than 30% of a house's front visibility, and fence colors must follow an approved palette. All signed with her name, as if she were the mayor of Willow Creek. But what really got Benjamin's blood boiling was the official justification, which Donna Clara read aloud from a copy of the document. The red oak, the one he watered with care, and that shaded summer afternoons disrupted the neighborhood's visual harmony. Harmony. The word buzzed in his head like an annoying fly. Anyone who looked at the oak saw history, life, a piece of the past still breathing. But Meredith? She saw a problem. An obstacle to her perfect neighborhood, where everything seemed to have to bend to her ruler. Back on his porch, Benjamin stared at the oak, the now cold coffee mug in his hand. He knew it wasn't just about the tree. Meredith wasn't merely testing the neighborhood's rules, she was testing him. And for the first time in years, Benjamin felt he needed to play the game. Not to win, but to protect what was his. Because if she thought she could order the oak to be cut down, what would come next? His house? His freedom? He shook his head, chuckling to himself at the irony. Visual preservation, he muttered. Let's see who preserves what. 4 days later, Willow Creek seemed to have settled into a wary calm. Gossip about the Visual Preservation Subcommittee still buzzed in corner conversations, but no one had seen Meredith since the last Homeowners Association meeting, where she showed up with a notebook full of unsolicited notes. Benjamin, meanwhile, tried to stick to his routine. Coffee on the porch, work in the carpentry shop, one eye on the red oak that now seemed to carry a weight heavier than its roots. He even considered installing a cheap camera in the yard, but dismissed it as paranoia. I'm not going to become a hostage to the crazy neighbor, he told himself, laughing to shake off the unease. But in the early hours of Saturday, around 3 in the morning, a strange sound shattered the silence. It was metallic, rhythmic, like a saw biting into wood. Benjamin woke with a start, his heart racing before he even registered what he was, hearing. He leaped out of bed, still in a t-shirt and pajama pants, and rushed to the back window. The full moon cast a silvery glow over the yard, and there, under the oak's branches, he saw a shadow move, too quick to make out. The sound stopped abruptly, leaving only the hum of crickets and the pounding in his chest. Barefoot, with a flashlight in hand, Benjamin hurried downstairs and flung open the back door. The cold night air hit him like a slap, but he barely noticed. When he reached the oak, the flashlight's beam revealed the worst. A fresh cut at the base of the tree, a straight, deep gash made with an electric saw. It wasn't enough to bring the oak down, but the message was clear: someone wanted it to fall. Benjamin ran his hand over the bark, feeling its rough texture against his fingers, and a hot anger surged through him. It wasn't just a tree. It was a piece of him, his history, his home. Whoever did this knew that. He went back inside, grabbed his phone, and called the police. While he waited, he paced the living room in circles, flashlight still in hand, trying to piece things together. He had no doubt who was behind it. Meredith, with her fake smiles and made-up rules, had gone too far. But why? What did a tree, a yard, or a random carpenter have to do with her crusade for harmony? Benjamin pictured her face, that cold gaze that seemed to dissect everything, and felt a shiver that wasn't from the cold. The police arrived half an hour later, two weary officers who swept their brighter flashlights across the yard. They took photos, asked questions, but the verdict was as frustrating as expected. No cameras, no footprints, no witnesses. There wasn't much they could do. Could have been a vandal, some kid messing around, one of them suggested, scribbling in a notepad. Benjamin just shook his head, biting his tongue to keep from saying what he really thought. Vandal, my foot. This had a name, a blonde bun, and an address at the corner house. When the officers left, the sun was beginning to rise, painting the sky a pale pink. Benjamin stayed in the yard, staring at the cut in the oak, phone still in hand. He knew pointing. The finger at Meredith without proof would be like playing chess with a bad gambit. She seemed like the type who was always 2 steps ahead. But doing nothing wasn't an option either. If you were in his shoes, what would you do? Confront the neighbor based on a hunch, risking looking like the crazy one? Or swallow the anger, gathering evidence until you had something solid? Benjamin wasn't sure, but one thing he knew, that cut wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. On Monday, the sky over Willow Creek was grey, with heavy clouds that seemed to carry more than just rain. Benjamin, still fuming over the cut in the oak, was on the porch fixing a broken chair when the mailman appeared. "Got a registered letter for you, Ben," said old Jonas, handing over an envelope with the air of someone who already knew it wasn't good news. Benjamin opened it carefully, as if it might explode. There it was, in bold, authoritative black. Letters notice of violation, Willow Creek Gardens Council. And at the bottom, the signature he'd expected. Meredith Clark, interim president. Interim president, Benjamin muttered, almost laughing at the audacity. The notice demanded the immediate removal of the red oak, citing structural risk in case of storms. It was so absurd it almost felt like a joke. The oak was as sturdy as a rock, with roots that probably stretched halfway across the neighborhood. Benjamin read the document 3 times, searching for any shred of legitimacy, but it all reeked of fabrication. The worst part, though, was Meredith's title. Since when did Willow Creek have an interim president? He knew the neighborhood council, a group of retirees who discussed bush trimming and end-of-year barbecues, not a dictatorship, run by a blonde bun. Still holding the paper, Benjamin grabbed his phone and called Donna Clara, who, besides being the neighborhood gossip, was the council's unofficial secretary. "Clara, what's this about an interim president?" he asked, cutting to the chase. On the other end of the line, he heard a sigh so long it seemed to carry years of exhausted patience. "Boy, you're not going to believe this," she began. According to Clara, Meredith had shown up at an informal get-together at Mrs. Torres's house with coffee and cookies and turned the chat into an official session without anyone noticing. With a handful of well-placed phrases and a smile, straight out of a toothpaste commercial, she appointed herself leader, claiming it was necessary to streamline decisions. Most of those present, distracted by the cookies or half-deaf, didn't even realize what was happening. "By the time I figured it out, she was already sending emails like she was the queen," Clara vented. Benjamin hung up the phone with a mix of anger and disbelief. Meredith wasn't just controlling, she was a strategist manipulating the neighborhood's rules like a chessboard. But this time, she'd picked the wrong opponent. He spent the rest of the morning making calls, talking to other council members. Mr. Torres confirmed Clara's story, a bit embarrassed for not paying attention. Mrs. Lima, who handled the council's budget, assured him there had never been a vote for a president, interim or otherwise. Each conversation was a piece of the puzzle, and Benjamin started jotting everything down in an old notebook, his handwriting sloppy with more anger than organization. But he knew notes and outrage weren't enough. If Meredith was playing dirty, he needed someone who knew the game better than she did. That's when he thought of Gregory, an old high school friend who was now a lawyer specializing in neighborhood disputes. Gregory had an easy laugh and a knack for dismantling self-important bureaucrats. Benjamin met him late that afternoon, at a simple bar across town, with brick walls and the smell of fried food in the air. Over a beer and a plate of fries, he laid it all out. The oak, the midnight cut, the fake committee, the notice. Gregory listened intently, tapping his fingers on the table, and gave a crooked smile. "This Meredith thinks she's the sheriff of Willow Creek," he said, flipping through the notice Benjamin had brought. "But you know what's worse than a nosy neighbor who doesn't read the bylaws. We'll find her Achilles' heel, Ben. Bring me everything you've got, and I'll see where she stepped out of line." Benjamin returned home with a lighter weight on his shoulders, but still kept his eyes on the oak, which seemed sturdy despite the scar at its base. He knew the fight was just beginning. Meredith might have the pen and paper, but Benjamin had something she underestimated: roots, not just the trees, but his own, planted deep in that neighborhood, in that life. And if she wanted war, he was ready to fight, with evidence, not saws. After the talk with Gregory, Benjamin came home with a clarity he hadn't felt in days. It wasn't just anger or instinct anymore. Now he had a plan. "If she wants to play by rules, we'll play by the real ones," he thought, as he opened his laptop to research security cameras. That same week, he hired a local technician, Tiago, a guy with a backward cap who seemed more excited about the neighborhood drama than the job itself. "So it's against the crazy neighbor, huh?" Tiago asked while installing a discreet camera on the porch. Benjamin just gave a half smile. "Let's just say it's to protect what's mine." The cameras were small but smart. They covered the yard, the front of the house, and of course the red oak, which now felt like a monument under surveillance. Benjamin started checking the footage every morning, sipping coffee with one eye on the mug and the other on his phone. It wasn't paranoia, he told himself, it was strategy. And if Meredith or some lackey of hers showed up again with a saw, this time it wouldn't just be a shadow slipping away in the night, but cameras were just the start. Following another tip from Gregory, Benjamin called in an arborist, Dr. Mendez, a grey-bearded man who seemed born with a pruning tape in hand. The man spent an entire morning in the yard, measuring, poking the soil, analyzing the cut at the oak's base. Benjamin stood nearby, trying not to hover but dying of curiosity. When the report arrived 2 days later, it was like a punch of relief. The oak was not only in excellent health, with strong roots and no risk of falling, but it was also valued at $35,000. $35,000. Benjamin read the number, 3 times imagining what he'd say to Meredith's face if he could. A common tree to her, but a legal asset, and a symbol to him. With the report in hand, Benjamin felt the ground steadier beneath his feet. The attack on the oak, once just an unprovable act of vandalism, was now a serious crime of property damage. He organized everything into a folder: the arborist's report, screenshots from the cameras, which for now only showed squirrels, and the mailman, and even a copy of Meredith's ridiculous notice with her fake interim president title. Gregory reviewed the documents one Friday night over a beer on Benjamin's porch. "This is gold, Ben," he said, tapping the folder. "If she comes at you again, we won't just shut down her claims. We can turn the tables. Emotional distress. Maybe." He winked with the air of someone already picturing the courtroom. Benjamin was starting to savor the feeling of being one step ahead. For the first time in weeks, he could look at the oak without that tightness in his chest, just a quiet certainty that no one would touch it without consequences. He imagined Meredith in her corner house, writing another one of her jargon-filled letters, oblivious to what was coming her way. Armed with cameras, a $35,000 report, and the backing of a lawyer who loved a challenge, Benjamin thought he was ready for anything. Truly anything. But Willow Creek had its own plans. And what was waiting for him around the next corner wasn't something cameras or reports could predict. The week passed like a taut rope, ready to snap at any moment. Benjamin checked the cameras every morning, almost like a ritual, sipping coffee, while his phone showed the empty yard, the red oak standing firm under sun or rain. He knew Meredith wouldn't give up. Not after the report, the ignored notice, the neighborhood council starting to question the interim president. But imagining what she'd do was one thing. Seeing her in action was something else entirely. On Thursday around 3 in the morning, Willow Creek's silence was broken by a persistent beep from Benjamin's phone. He jolted awake, his heart already in his throat before he even understood what was happening. It was the camera app, alerting him to movement in the yard. He grabbed the phone with slightly trembling hands, opened the live feed, and froze. There was a hooded figure, face obscured by a black hood, holding a chainsaw that gleamed under the faint moonlight. The silhouette was unmistakable, the blonde bun peeking out from under the hood, the rigid posture he already knew from meetings, and sideways glances Meredith. Benjamin didn't think twice. He hit the button on the app that activated the yard's automatic lights, spotlights he'd installed along with the cameras, courtesy of Tiago and his enthusiasm for high-tech pranks. The yard exploded into light as if it were midday, and the chainsaw hit the ground with a heavy thud. Meredith spun around, her hood slipping partway off, and for a split second the camera caught her face, eyes wide, not with fear, but with a rage that seemed to swallow the night. Before she could grab the saw, Benjamin triggered the alarm from his phone, a piercing sound that sliced through the early morning like a knife. Meredith hesitated, glanced around and bolted, leaping over the back fence with an agility no one would have expected from a woman who lived in tailored suits and heels. Benjamin sat frozen in bed, phone still in hand, his heart pounding so loud it seemed to compete with the alarm. He turned off the sound but couldn't tear his eyes away from the footage, now looping in the app. It was her, clear as day, Meredith Clark, the perfect neighbor, the interim president, trying to take down the oak with a chainsaw like the villain in a B-movie. He saved the video, backed it up in 2 places, and called the police before even putting on his shoes. By morning, the neighborhood was buzzing like an anthill. 2 officers knocked on the corner house's door, and Meredith was taken to the station with the expression of someone who'd just bitten into a lemon. Benjamin handed over the video, the arborist's report, the fake notice, everything he and Gregory had compiled. During the interrogation, according to the gossip grapevine, for Donna Clara, Meredith denied everything with the straightest face imaginable. Me? With a chainsaw? I was just taking a walk around the neighborhood. I do that to relax. At 3 in the morning, in a hood. No one bought it, but without the chainsaw, which she must have tossed into some bushes during her escape. The police could only hold her for a few hours. Meanwhile, Willow Creek turned into a cauldron of whispers. At the bakery, the bus stop, Donna Clara's coffee circle, everyone had a theory. She was always weird, but this is next level, said Mr. Torres, still sore about the clothesline scolding. Think it's because of grief? Losing her husband? And all? Ventured Mrs. Lima, her voice tinged with pity. Grief, my foot. She's possessed by regulations, retorted Tiago, now practically an honorary neighborhood detective. Benjamin listened to it all, but didn't say much. He'd won a battle. Meredith exposed the oak still standing, but the questions swirling in everyone's conversations wouldn't leave his mind. What's wrong with Meredith? Because no one risks so much, lies so brazenly, over a tree. Or was it more than that? Benjamin's camera footage hit Willow Creek like a bomb. First it was Donna Clara, who sent the file to the neighborhood WhatsApp group with the caption, "Look who decided to become a lumberjack." Within hours, the clip of Meredith in a hood, tripping over her own chainsaw as she fled the alarm, had been seen by everyone. From Mr. Torres, watching with his glasses perched on the tip of his nose, to the teens on the back street, who turned the scene into a meme with a horror movie soundtrack. What started as a scandal became a catalyst. Meredith's mask, so carefully polished with smiles and notices, was cracking, and the neighbors, who'd once only grumbled in corners, began to speak up. It wasn't just the oak. As the video passed from phone to phone, buried stories started bubbling up. Mrs. Lima, who managed the council's budget, revealed that Meredith had reported the association for misuse of funds months ago, just because she didn't like the choice of flowers for the town square planter. The young couple at House 23, with a baby who barely slept, confessed they'd received an anonymous letter, but in her unmistakable handwriting, complaining about the child's nighttime crying. Even Mr. Torres, still stung by the clothesline incident, dug up a complaint Meredith had filed against him for parking his bicycle at an irregular angle. Each story was another brick in the wall the neighborhood was building against her. "Does she think she owns the block?" asked Tiago, the camera technician, during an impromptu chat at the bakery. "Worse," replied Donna Clara, taking a sip of coffee. "She thinks she owns us." The breaking point came when Harold Jenkins, the real council president, a gravelly-voiced retiree who preferred tending his garden to dealing with bureaucracy, heard about the circus Meredith had created. Harold was the kind of guy who only showed up at meetings to approve barbecues or collect cans for Christmas. But when he learned about the interim president nonsense, his eyes sparked with a rage no one expected. "This ends now," he said, slamming his fist on his living room table where Benjamin and other neighbors had gathered. That same afternoon, Harold fired off an email with the subject line in all caps: "Extraordinary meeting, urgent." The meeting took place on Friday night in the community hall, a small shed with plastic chairs and a fan that made more noise than breeze. The place was packed, rare for a neighborhood where half the meetings were just Donna Clara talking to herself. Neighbors of all ages squeezed into chairs, lined the aisles, and leaned against the walls. Benjamin stood in a corner, arms crossed, watching as Harold stepped onto the makeshift stage. "Good evening, folks," he began, his voice steady despite the crackling microphone. "No coffee or cookies tonight, just the truth." He held up a folder, the same one Benjamin had provided, with the Oaks report, the videos, the fake notices, and made it clear. Meredith hadn't just lied about being president. She'd manipulated, intimidated, and tried to run the neighborhood like it was her personal fiefdom. The room erupted in murmurs, applause, and even a few shouts of "Enough!" Mrs. Lima raised her hand and shared about the complaints against the association. The couple with the baby, sporting deep under-eye circles, spoke about the letter that made them feel like intruders in their own home. Even Tiago, who wasn't one for meetings, asked to speak, saying with a crooked grin, "If she hates Ben's Oak so much, imagine what she thinks of my Christmas lights." The laughter that followed lightened the air, but not the purpose. When Harold proposed suspending Meredith from any position or representative role, hands shot up in unison like a wave. Not a single vote against, not one abstention. Meredith Clark, for the first time, was out of the game. As the crowd filed out of the hall, still buzzing with adrenaline, Benjamin stayed by the door, greeting neighbors he barely knew. For the first time in weeks, he felt he wasn't alone. The Oak was still standing, and now the neighborhood was too. But deep down he knew Meredith wasn't the type to accept defeat quietly. Want to know how Willow Creek truly came together? Hold on, because the story's far from over, and what's coming next will give you chills. The week after the extraordinary meeting passed, with a deceptive calm in Willow Creek. Meredith's suspension had left the neighborhood in a mix of relief and anticipation, as if everyone were waiting for her next move. But the sky had other plans. On Wednesday night, a storm descended on the city like an uninvited guest. The wind howled, ripping branches and tossing trash cans through the streets. Lightning streaked the sky, followed by thunder that made windows rattle. Benjamin stayed up all night, checking the cameras on his phone, not out of fear of Meredith, but because the Oak, sturdy as it was, faced gusts that seemed determined to test its roots. He stayed on the porch until dawn, flashlight in hand, relieved to see his old friend with red leaves still standing tall. When the rain let up in the morning, Willow Creek looked like a battlefield. Fallen trees blocked sidewalks, power lines, hung like broken webs, and the sound of sirens cut through the air. Benjamin slipped on his boots, grabbed a handsaw, ironic, he thought, and went out to help. Mr. Torres needed to clear his driveway, where an alder branch had fallen, and Benjamin spent an hour cutting wood while the old man shared stories of worse storms in the 70s. "This generation doesn't know real wind," Torres said with a crooked smile, holding the flashlight. It was on his way back, shirt clinging to his body from sweat and rain, that Benjamin saw the corner house, or rather what was left of it. A massive pine tree, which he'd always noticed in front of Meredith's house, now lay sprawled across her living room. It had torn off half the roof and crushed the wide windows she took such pride in keeping spotless. Glass glittered on the lawn, mixed with splinters of wood and torn curtains fluttering in the wind. Benjamin stopped, mouth agape, as neighbors began to gather, forming a semicircle of onlookers in raincoats with phones in hand. "It's her pine," muttered Donna Clara appearing beside Benjamin with a lopsided umbrella. The city told her to remove that thing years ago. It was dead, rotten inside. She fought it, said it was property heritage. Clara let out a dry chuckle, unable to hide her amusement at the irony. Benjamin stared at the wreckage, picturing Meredith amidst the debris, maybe still with that perfect bun, trying to blame someone for the disaster. The pine, which she'd defended tooth and nail, had become her nemesis, while the oak across the street stood untouched, swaying calmly in the remaining breeze. Gossip spread faster than the storm, as city crews cleared the streets and power. Slowly returned, the neighborhood talked of nothing else. Tiago, who showed up to help with an actual chainsaw, couldn't resist. She wanted to cut down Ben's oak for structural risk, right? Look at the structural risk right in her living room now. Mrs. Lima, ever more reserved, shook her head. It's sad, but she brought this on herself. Even Harold, coordinating the cleanup with a makeshift megaphone, let slip a comment. If she'd listened to the city, she wouldn't be sweeping branches out of her living room. Benjamin returned home with a mix of emotions. Part of him wanted to laugh at the poetic justice. Meredith, obsessed with controlling everything, defeated by her own stubbornness. But another part, smaller, wondered what drove someone to ignore warnings to cling to a dead tree while trying to destroy a living one. He looked at the oak, still standing strong, and thought, sometimes what falls isn't just wood. Sometimes it's everything someone built on lies. The morning sun struggled to pierce the clouds still lingering over Willow Creek, but the neighborhood was already buzzing with activity. Firefighters in their orange vests milled around Meredith's house, assessing the damage from the pine that had turned her living room into an apocalyptic movie set. Yellow tape cordoned off the lawn, where chunks of roof and broken branches formed a chaotic pile. Neighbors clustered on the sidewalk, keeping a respectful distance but with phones in hand, ready to capture any new development. Benjamin was there, a few meters away, helping Mrs. Lima carry smaller branches to a corner. He tried not to stare too much at the corner house, not out of fear, but because the weight of the irony was still fresh. That's when Meredith appeared. She emerged at the door, her bun half undone, her once pristine blouse now crumpled and streaked with dust. Her eyes swept the crowd, and when they landed on Benjamin, something seemed to snap. "You!" she shouted, pointing a trembling finger in his direction. Her voice cut through the chatter like a knife. "It was you who sent that tree to attack me." The silence that followed was so heavy that even the firefighters paused, turning to see what was happening. Benjamin blinked, stunned, clutching a branch in his hand as if it were proof of his innocence. What?" he managed to say. But Meredith didn't stop. She stormed across the lawn, ignoring the yellow tape, her eyes wide with a fury that seemed to come from another world. "Don't play dumb, Benjamin. You sabotaged my house, you and that cursed tree of yours. You're an enemy infiltrated in this community, trying to destroy everything I've built." Each word came out louder, more incoherent, and embarrassment rippled through the sidewalk like a wave. Donna Clara, standing beside Benjamin, muttered a quiet, "My God," while Tiago, filming with his phone, let slip a, "This is getting wild." Neighbors started exchanging glances, some laughing nervously, others whispering with pity. The scene was a sad spectacle. Meredith, the woman who once intimidated with notices and cold smiles, was now unraveling in public, hurling accusations that sounded like they came from a nightmare. A police officer, Detective Nolan, a middle-aged man with the patience of someone who'd seen it all, approached with his hands raised like he was calming a frightened animal. "Mrs. Clark, please, let's talk calmly," he said, his voice firm but kind. But Meredith wasn't listening. She pointed at Benjamin, at the distant oak, at the sky, as if everything were part of a conspiracy. "He planned this. Him and the others, they want to drive me out." The situation became untenable when she tried to lunge toward Benjamin, tripping over a branch and nearly falling. Nolan and another firefighter gently restrained her while she kept shouting, now mixing insults with nonsensical phrases about stolen harmony. The detective exchanged a look with an arriving paramedic, and the decision was made in minutes. Meredith needed to be taken for a psychological evaluation. It wasn't an arrest, but a temporary hold for her safety and others. As they led her to an ambulance, with her still muttering accusations, the neighborhood watched in silence. Phones recorded everything, not out of malice but because no one could believe what they were seeing. When the ambulance turned the corner, it was as if Willow Creek could breathe again. Benjamin stood there, branch still in hand, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes. "You okay, Ben?" asked Harold, clapping him on the shoulder. Benjamin just nodded, unsure of what to say. It wasn't victory, it wasn't relief. It was something messier, like watching a castle collapse and realizing it was made of sand. In the days that followed, the neighborhood began to transform. Neighbors who barely greeted each other now swapped ideas for cleaning the streets. Donna Clara organized a cleanup effort for those who'd lost roof tiles in the storm. Tiago and the couple with the baby started planning a community party to remind us we're stronger than rotten pines, as he put it, laughing. But amid the unity, one question lingered. What had happened to Meredith? The woman who'd arrived like a force of nature was now carted away, shackled by her own delusions. And as Willow Creek rebuilt, Benjamin couldn't stop thinking. Had the storm merely revealed what she'd been carrying inside all along? The storm left Willow Creek with scars, but also with new energy. While the streets were cleared and conversations revolved around Meredith's meltdown, Benjamin and Gregory worked behind the scenes. With the arborist's report, that document, that turned the oak into a $35,000 asset, and the crystal-clear camera footage of Meredith with her chainsaw, Gregory crafted a lawsuit that was practically a work of art. Trespassing, attempted property damage, intentional endangerment, he listed, eyes gleaming one night on Benjamin's porch. "She's not getting out of this one, Ben." Days later, the judge agreed. He authorized a freeze on Meredith's assets to secure potential compensation if the case moved forward. It was a concrete victory, a slap in the face to her fake notices and invented rules. Benjamin should have been relieved. He should have been toasting with Gregory, maybe even chuckling at the thought of Meredith getting the news in the clinic where she was admitted. But something held him back from celebrating. Over the past few days, he'd noticed changes in the oak. The leaves, which always blazed in the fall, seemed to wilt too soon. Smaller branches were dry, snapping off with the slightest breeze. He tried to ignore it, telling himself it was just the stress of the storm. But the tightness in his chest didn't lie. When Donna Clara showed up with a carrot cake and a worried look, suggesting they call Dr. Mendez again, Benjamin gave in. The arborist arrived on a chilly morning, with the same meticulous air as before. He spent hours examining the trunk, the cut from that fateful night, the roots he'd once praised. When he was done, the verdict hit like a kick. The cut, though not deep enough to topple the tree at the time, had compromised its structure. Meredith's saw had opened a path for fungi, weakening the flow of sap. "She's fighting, but she won't hold on much longer," Mendez said, his voice heavy, as if speaking about an old friend. "Best to remove it before it falls and hurts someone." Benjamin stood beside the oak, his hand on the bark, saying nothing. It was as if the ground had vanished beneath him. The news spread through Willow Creek like a silent wave. That night, the bakery became an impromptu gathering spot. Neighbors who barely exchanged glances months ago now shared tables, speaking softly about the oak. "It's like losing a piece of the neighborhood," said Mrs. Lima, stirring her coffee with a sigh. Tiago, who usually joked about everything, just shook his head. "Man, that oak was more Willow Creek than we are." Even Mr. Torres, who spent his days grumbling about the world, left a small flower from his garden at the tree's base, without a word. Benjamin heard it all, felt every gesture, but the grief was his in a way no one could carry. The tree, his father planted, that he watered, that withstood storms and sores, wouldn't survive one neighbor's obsession. But amid the sadness, something new was growing. Donna Clara showed up at Benjamin's house with a notebook, saying the neighborhood wanted to do something. "It's not just about the tree, Ben. It's about what it meant." The idea came from a talk with Harold. Plant a new tree altogether, in the same spot. The couple with the baby suggested raising money for a park bench with a plaque reading Willow Creek Oak. Tiago, of course, was already talking about installing solar lights to make the spot livelier than ever. Even Gregory, always focused on paperwork, promised to ensure Meredith's compensation covered it all and more. "She screwed the tree, but she'll fund the next one," he said with a crooked smile. Benjamin listened to it all, sitting on his porch, looking at the oak that still held on for a few more days. The grief wouldn't fade anytime soon, maybe never. But there, with the neighborhood stirring, planning, coming together like never before, he felt a warmth that wasn't just from the coffee in his hand. Meredith may have cut down the tree, but unwittingly, she'd planted something bigger, a community that now knew what was worth protecting. The removal of the old oak was a quiet day in Willow Creek. Benjamin watched, arms crossed on his porch, as the city crew worked carefully, as if they knew it wasn't just a tree. The sound of the chainsaw, so different from that night with Meredith, felt like a respectful farewell. When the last branch fell, he turned and went inside, unable to look at the emptiness where the oak had reigned. The neighborhood respected his space, but small gestures of care appeared. A basket of muffins from Mrs. Lima, a scribbled note from Tiago saying, "Stay strong, bro," even a colorful drawing from the kid at House 23, with a red oak bigger than the page. But days later, something shifted the air in Willow Creek. On a clear morning, with a sky so blue it seemed to apologize for the storm, a green truck parked in front of Benjamin's house. Out came a young tree, a red oak with vibrant leaves, its roots carefully wrapped. Benjamin stepped out to see, confused, as the driver handed him a letter. "Hey, it's for you, man. And there's more stuff paid for, see?" the man said, pointing to the receipt. Benjamin opened the envelope with hesitant fingers, and the words inside caught him off guard. Signed by Edward Clark, Meredith's ex-husband, the letter was short, but weighty. "Benjamin, I don't know you, but I know what Meredith did. I can't erase the pain or the loss, but I want to help make it right. This tree comes from a historic sapling in Oakville, the town where I grew up. I hope it brings new roots to your yard. The legal costs are covered too. Good luck." Benjamin read the letter 3 times, standing on the lawn, with the truck still there and neighbors starting to gather, curious. Edward Clark, a name he never expected to hear, let alone tied to a gesture like this. Donna Clara, already on the sidewalk with her gossip radar on, grabbed his arm. "It's her ex, right? That lawyer who vanished from town years ago. My God, Ben, this is chilling." Benjamin just nodded, speechless. The idea that something good, something alive, could rise from the chaos Meredith left was almost too much to process. The neighborhood didn't waste any time. Harold, with his grandpa energy for organizing barbecues, took charge of turning the replanting into an event. "It's not just a tree, it's a fresh start," he told Benjamin over the phone, already planning everything. The following Saturday, Benjamin's yard became the heart of Willow Creek. Makeshift tables spread across the grass, covered with checkered tablecloths and shared dishes, Donna Clara's carrot cake, Mrs. Lima's feijoada, even a questionable dish from Tiago, which he swore was gourmet mac and cheese. Kids ran around, hanging colorful notes on a nearby fence with messages like "Grow strong" and "Welcome new tree." The couple with the baby brought their little one, who giggled while trying to grab the young oak's leaves. Benjamin, shovel in hand, led the planting, but he wasn't alone. Harold dug beside him, grumbling about his knee, while Tiago and Mr. Torres held the tree to keep it straight. When the final layer of soil was packed down, the whole neighborhood seemed to be there, clapping like it was a championship final. Harold climbed onto a crate, because a stage was too fancy, and cleared his throat to speak. "You all know, I'm not one for speeches," he began, his voice gravelly. "But that old tree we lost, it was about roots. This new one here, it's about unity. We fought, we suffered, but look where we are now. Together. And that, my friends, is stronger than any storm." The crowd erupted in applause, laughter, even a few teary eyes. Benjamin stayed quiet, looking at the young oak which swayed gently in the breeze. He thought of his father, the old oak, the nights checking cameras, the anger that nearly consumed him. But there, with the neighborhood around him, the weight he'd carried for months seemed to spread to everyone's shoulders, and somehow it felt lighter. Months flew by in Willow Creek, like leaves carried on a gentle breeze. The dust from the storm, the heated meetings, and the sirens had settled. But the story of the red oak remained, woven into the neighborhood like its own sidewalks. Meredith, after a trial that no one in the neighborhood missed a beat of, was ordered to pay hefty damages. The arborist's report and the chainsaw footage did their job. The judge also ruled that she leave Willow Creek, a decision that, to many, felt less like punishment and more like liberation. The corner house, with its broken windows and bitter memories, was put up for sale before the echo of the courtroom gavel had even faded. In Meredith's place came a young couple, the Almeidas, he, a history teacher with crooked glasses, she, an illustrator who showed up at the bakery with a sketchbook full of neighborhood drawings. They arrived with an energy that seemed to clear the air, painting the fence white and hanging string lights on the porch that glowed during warm nights. Donna Clara, of course, was the first to bring a welcome cake, returning with gossip that the two loved hearing about the oak. "They're already calling Ben's yard the Legends Corner," she said, laughing, as she shared a coffee with Benjamin. "And the new tree?" It grew with a vigor that seemed to defy time. The young red oak, planted with so many hands and hopes, stretched its branches as if eager to embrace the yard. Benjamin watered it carefully, sometimes pausing to compare it to the old oak in his memory. It wasn't the same, never would be, but it had a life that warmed his chest. Neighborhood kids, including the child from House 23, already used its shade to play, leaving toy cars and colorful pebbles around the trunk, like offerings to a guardian. The story of the old oak became part of Willow Creek's fabric. At weekend, barbecues with tables overflowing with feijoada and sweating beer bottles in the heat, someone always brought it up. "Remember when that nutcase came with the chainsaw?" Tiago would say, fork in the air, and the group would burst into laughter. On evening walks, when the sky turned orange and dogs tugged at their leashes, couples like the Almeidas listened to Harold retell the saga, with details that grew with each telling. In the latest version, Meredith had nearly bulldozed Benjamin's house with an imaginary tractor. "It's legend, but it's ours," Harold would say, with a smile that mixed pride and nostalgia. Benjamin now saw everything through different eyes. The carpenter who once kept to himself, fixing chairs and watering herbs, had learned something. No saw could cut. Sometimes destruction, a felled tree, a fractured neighborhood, forces you to rebuild. And in the chaos, the deepest roots take hold. Those of neighbors who became family, strangers who became friends, a community that discovered its strength. He thought about this as he worked in the yard, carving a new bench to sit under the young oak with a simple plaque, "Willow Creek Roots." If someone asked Benjamin what he took from this story, he might point to the new oak, to the laughing faces at the barbecue, to the string lights at the corner house, and maybe he'd invite them to pause for a second and listen, because it wasn't just about trees. It was about new beginnings, about how what breaks can grow again, stronger. And looking at the sky with the weight of months finally light on his shoulders, he felt this story was worth telling, sharing, living for anyone who's ever found new life where they only saw an end.